Thank you, Mary. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Wanjing Kelly Chen. And actually, we had hoped that she could have presented in person last spring before she finished her dissertation, but unfortunately that wasn't possible due to COVID-19. But now she's beaming in from Hong Kong, and we're very happy to have her do this talk today. So Kelly, as most of us know her as, is now a research assistant professor at the Division of Social Science at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Just to give a little background, she completed her dissertation earlier this year, and the title of her dissertation was The Power of Image, State, Capital, and Politics in the Grounding of Belt and Road in Laos. And essentially, she'll be presenting today one of the chapters from that dissertation, which was very well received by her committee, which was chaired by Stephen Young in geography, and also included Chris Olds, who is another member of our Southeast Asian community here at UW-Madison. So Kelly actually completed her BSc in Geographical Information Systems at Beijing Normal University in 2011. And then in 2012, she completed a BA in English at Beijing Normal as well, and then went on to do an MSc in Geography at Beijing Normal before coming to UW-Madison shortly after that. And I was a member of her committee as well, and I was very happy to be able to support her when she decided that she was interested in doing research in Laos about Chinese involvement. I mean, this is a very important topic because there's a lot of discussion nowadays about the involvement of China in Laos and what it all means. I mean, China not only in Laos, but in other countries. And you may have heard that recently, just the other day, a former Singaporean diplomat actually made some very controversial comments about Cambodia and Laos being potentially kicked out of ASEAN because they are seen to be too close to China. So I think that in many ways, Kelly's research is very important and timely because it helps us ground, I think, some of the stereotypes and perceptions that people have about Chinese involvement in Laos. And I think that you'll find her presentation today very useful in understanding. She spent a year doing ethnographic research in Laos, primarily in Vientiane, regarding, and then some previous time before then in doing preliminary research. So she's done a lot of work on the ground on this issue, and I think her contribution should be very, very useful for us to listen to today. So without further ado, Kelly, please take it away.
Okay. Can you hear me? Should be okay, right? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you so much for your flattering introduction, Ian. I feel really honored to be invited back so quickly. In my years in medicine, the center provided me with amazing mentorship, companions, and fundings that enable this research in Laos. And today I'm here to present part of it. In the early February of 2018, some Chinese workers gathered in front of a labor camp of a Chinese state-owned enterprise that coordinated the ongoing construction of the TRANS-LAOS Railway, an infrastructure project featured in Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. A few desperate workers at Xing had worked on the project for almost a year without getting paid. In order to enlist public support for their wage battle, they held a large white banner saying, Power China, pay the money I earned with blood and sweat. I want to go home for the new year, in both Chinese and poorly translated English and Thai. While construction sector globally is known for its draconian treatment of labor, the peculiar form of labor politics erupted on this PRI project is deeply related to its controversial financial regime. The Belt and Road Initiative is Chinese state's agenda to realign global political economy through a web of transnational infrastructure. Depending on how you define the scope of it, BRI is estimated to cost from $1 to $8 trillion. Since the very beginning, the financial structure of the initiative has been the focal point of global backlash. Central to the critique is that many of the countries hosting BRI project are southern states with poor fiscal stability. As they take out sheer amount of loans from China to finance BRI, they will become over-indebted and risk sinking into sovereign debt crisis. So there has been a popular perception believing that Beijing is intentionally making southern countries financially more dependent on China, so to hold them captive to its wish and demand in the future. Among the list of countries falling into China's debt trap is Laos. Under Belt and Road Initiative, Laos hosts a section of a railway that is supposed to eventually connect China's landlocked southwest to Singapore. It is an important leg of BRI on mainland Southeast Asia. Estimated cost of the Laos section in this railway alone is $6 billion. And in 2015, the Laos state entered an agreement to develop the railway with China in the form of bilateral joint venture. It holds 30% share of the railway, which then requires some $700 million funding commitment. And 2/3 of that amount will be covered by a loan from China EXIM Bank. It is this loan that placed Laos solidly on the list of likely victim debt trap by China. This is a figure produced by global financial watchdog showing the extent to which Laos sovereign debt has ballooned up to an unsustainable level after taking out the railway loan. As the country's economy suffered from the blow of COVID this year, its ability to service debt is further undermined. Earlier this year, Laos state had just asked China, its biggest foreign creditor now, for debt restructuring as it's sliding into default due to COVID. It seized major control of the national electric power grid to a Chinese SOE in a debt for equity swap to stay afloat. So in this regard, the dominant interpretation of the financial implication of BRI is legit if taken out the conspiracy component. There is no evidence proving that China is motivated from the onset to push borrowing states further down to the road of debt crisis, so to ensnare them to its command. But the lending certainly deepened the interdependency between China and southern states and afforded with more power to govern global affairs, especially in contingent moment when COVID sparked sovereign debt crisis is looming. We do need to look out to the potential approaches it will take to settle debt with borrowing states and their subsequent implications. But my concern is that we have been overly obsessed with predicting the future implication of China's lending. Debt of any kind is a temporal concept in which creditor claims debtor's future labor of repayment through present practice of lending. When it comes to debt making at interstatal level, that practice of lending is not fulfilled by some simple act of transferring money. It involves complicated processes to ground credit into certain designated outlet as both parties agreed on. In recent years, there have been tons of news flowing around about certain BRI loan deal caught up in some back and forth negotiation. They are clear indication that China's lending has not been going smooth. But these are treated as anecdotes and gossips of BRI and relegate into background story of that trap. What I would like to do in the rest of the presentation is to redirect attention to the twists and turns occurred in the making of sovereign debt and bring to light their important but under-recognized implications. I'll do so by teasing out how politics in the making of the Laos sovereign debt for the railway trickle down to the ground, producing financial entanglements between different streams of Chinese capital and exacerbate labor exploitations along the way. Taking this monumental handshaking moment as the entry point to my story. In November 2015, the then Laos Deputy Prime Minister Lunsava signed off the deal to develop TRANS-LAOS Railway through joint venture with China in Beijing. This kind of unnecessary ceremony was organized and publicized not only for geopolitical, diplomatic, and propaganda purposes. It is also tempted to send a strong message to Chinese capital market, mobilizing potential investors to come take up contract on the railway, as it appears to be a very financially secure project with strong state support. So following the ceremonial moment, a project company was first established as the direct institutional entity to receive and allocate funding and manage the implementation of the railway. Its shareholding structure is based upon the bilateral financial agreement. Chinese state held its 70% share through a consortium of 5 state-owned enterprises. The project company then divided the railway into 6 sections and assign each section to one Chinese SOE to manage. These mid-level coordinators are in full charge of the section they are assigned to. They allocate construction contracts to small contractors and suppliers, supervise their progress, and make payment accordingly. All the 6 coordinators are independent branch companies of the SOE that hold share on the railway. And below this managerial stratum, is a troop of Chinese suppliers and contractors who undertake de facto work on the ground. They enter the project through tendering bidding process. A lot of these small firms were fueled by private capital from China. So at this level, I encounter many 老板, which means people who are both major shareholder and operator of a business in Chinese. Most of them run business in China's domestic construction sector that has been laden with problem of overcapacity. They were therefore eager to take the chance of BRI as a springboard into overseas market. The hierarchical railway institution was consolidated by the end of 2016 through interlocking contractual relations between project company, coordinator, and ground level contractors and suppliers. The railway's division of labor as well as funding allocation were clarified. The project hit the ground after institutionalization. From this point onward, the mismatch between its construction progress and financial progress began to show. On one hand, tunnels are being dug and bridge pier laid. The nuts and bolts of the railway are being put together in reality and scheduled to complete on time in 2021. On the other hand, however, the creditor and the shareholder of the project have been extremely slow to scramble together all the funding as planned. In particular, the lion's share of Chinese loan to Laos was not injected into the project by the time I conduct field work in 2018, and that was almost 18 months into the construction. The railway's financial difficulty is produced by a combination of factors, so there isn't a single party to blame. 70% of the funding responsible by the Chinese SOEs arrives slowly because Beijing put in more bureaucratic red tape to reduce capital flight in recent years. So these SOEs have to go through extensively tedious procedure to gain permission for moving assets and capital from China into Laos. But what is severely delayed is the provision of the 30% funding responsible by the Laos side. As planned, roughly 1/3 of that would be covered by Laos state itself, and the rest would be supplied by the loan from China. But the 2 streams of funding are actually packed. Laos state's money work as necessary equity for the credit. It basically means that credit will only arrive proportionally to the amount of funding Lao government has injected into the railway. And this arrangement was set up for the sake of banking prudence. And because Lao has not been able to commit that funding from state budget, the bank did not provide a loan either. So basically, much of the 30% funding was just not there by the time I left Lao in June 2018. So the railway has been progressing forward in a chronic funding deficiency. It was particularly acute at the beginning of construction, but still haunted the project till today. Those who felt the pain first were the Laoban acting as ground level contractors and suppliers. Many of these individuals were lured into the project primarily because of its perceived financial security, the expectation that a BRI project with rather clear financial setup would definitely pay them for contract work, weighed heavily in their decision to place in bid. Just like one Laoban said, and I quote here, My prime principle in undertaking overseas construction work is that the project has to be financially stable. I pay specific attention to any project's financial mechanism and double-check information about loans with my friends in policy bank before making decision. I want to make sure I can definitely get paid. To this end, TRANS-LAOS Railway is attractive as it's a BRI project with clear funding source and strong state support. However, such great aspiration turned into great disillusion a few months into construction. Based on the contracts, they are required to kickstart construction first with their own capital and then receive payment from coordinators on a monthly basis. But the promised monthly payment was missed again and again and began putting enormous pressure on the Laoban because their own capital is being drained quickly to fuel everyday construction. It escalated tensions between Chinese actors on the railway. Increasing numbers of angry Laoban went to up-level coordinator demanding to get paid. The situation eventually prompted Chinese state to intervene in 2017. Beijing offered an emergency remedy by commanding the railway's shareholding SOEs to prioritize this project in their overall distribution of financial resource. Basically, these colossal enterprises were required to fill in the railway's funding gap with financial resources designated for their other uses. And in that exact same manner, these SOEs told the coordinators, aka their financially independent branch company, to shoulder part of the burden. Coordinators received a document from the railway project company stating that the project was weathering severe but temporal financial difficulties and mandated them to fund construction with their own capital, so to ensure the smooth progress on the ground. As financial exploitation trickles down, coordinators also managed to coerce Laoban to further commit their money into the project. But it is not done through straightforward socialist command because these are private capital at work, not state capital. Exactly how coordinators maneuver to coerce Laoban is captured through a story shared with me by one Laoban supplying cement for the railway. It happened when he went to the coordinator to ask for delayed payments. The manager there readily greeted him with documents that embodied Beijing's emergency remedy first. They then sold him an irrefutable fellow sufferer narrative, which basically says that all the SOEs were in the same boat with Laoban, being farmed for capital to support state agenda. And then they plead him to show his patriotism by maintaining construction momentum at any cost. And to be politically correct in that circumstances as a Chinese, he had little choice but to shut up. The SOE forces you to swallow your own bitterness, he complained to me later. Eventually, most Laoban put up with the elongated financial exploitation. What forced them into continuously pouring their own capital into the railway was not just a set of skillful maneuver from SOE manager. Rather, it was their unequal power relation with state capital that had already been built into the railway's contracts. So they generally require contractors and suppliers to transfer assets worth 3 to 5% value of the contract into the possession of the railway project company as security deposit from the onset. Laoban could only get it back if they finish assigned task on time with satisfactory quality. And then don't forget that they had been putting money into construction for several months when they become explicit about the project's upper level financial struggles. So if they quit at that point, it basically means giving up all the investment they had put in. Therefore, many Laoban felt the need to maintain a minimum construction progress to satisfy coordinator and wait till more arranged funding to arrive, as this appeared to be the most practical strategy to reduce their overall loss in the end. In this situation, the extent to which Laoban were able to secure payment from the above become largely defined by their relation with state-owned enterprise and their negotiation tactics. A few of them have improvised out some really creative strategies. The cement supplier Laoban, who shared the fellow sufferer story, for instance, find out that the SOEs are not afraid to be challenged by any Chinese actors, but they take it seriously when it when they were confronted by Lao actors, because they are afraid that the nasty aspect of BRI may explode under international spotlight. So what he did was that he tried to get Lao police to call the SOE for him to request for the delayed payment. But those who suffered most in the financial turmoil of the railway are not Laoban, but the labor on the ground, as Laoban tightened up their belt to sustain construction momentum in chronic funding deficiency. Labor exploitation in form of delayed, reduced, or even denied wage payment has been significantly exacerbated. In what follows, I'm going to recount the ups and downs of labor politics at a specific labor camp that stationed a workforce for tunnel construction. The Laoban running this camp did not receive any payment from coordinator for the first 8 months into construction. So in return, he stopped paying his labor after the first 2 months, therefore placed struggle over wage at the center of everyday politics in this microspace. It eventually led to the regeneration of his workforce. The longitudinal trend I captured at this site reflects the overall situation of labor along the railway. Okay, so at the beginning of construction, this Laoban assembled together a workforce with heavy presence of Lao labor and Lao equipment. He was inclined to use local labor and equipment because they were much cheaper than the imported ones from China. With the help of a couple translators, his Lao staff performed well on construction site along the Chinese technicians, and he paid them at the beginning of every month. But moving into the 3rd month, he decided to reduce expenditure as much as possible as he learned more about the railway's upper-level financial struggle. And it did not take long for the Lao labor to rise up against him. The first group of labor who confront his exploitation were the Lao construction workers. They are impoverished local villagers living near the construction site, as they count on the wage to sustain basic livelihood more than anyone else in the entire team. So just a week after promised monthly wage was not paid, these workers brought their families and friends from the community to the labor camp and besieged the Laoban's office. They insist to get paid immediately, secure the money, and just left, never come back to work again. The word spread that Chinese Laoban does not pay, so nobody from local community was willing to take up job on construction site afterward. And soon after that, other Lao staff in the construction team bargained to get their paycheck and left too. They demonstrate a diverse range of strategy to battle for wage. The most extreme episode was performed by a dump truck driver who had experience dealing with other Chinese investors in the past. So he really know how to drive a hard bargain in that situation. One night, he took a gun and went into the Laoban's office, pointed the gun at his face, and threatened to kill him if the wage was not paid by the end of that day. And of course, that driver succeeded. The Laoban recalled to me later that when the driver said, "This is Lao, not China. I can kill you with a shot now and toss your dead body into the river. Do you want to try that now?" He was truly scared, almost peed his pants, and seriously considered just fled back to China. The rapid departure of Lao labor left many vacancies to fill on the team. The Laoban shifted his labor sourcing strategy. Using the much more expensive labor and equipment from China this time, he reassembled an old China team that was not on a monthly wage regime. Instead, all the staff joined later agreed to be paid once in 3 months, 6 months, or even a year. This kind of wage regime is common in China's domestic construction sector. Although the amount of wage Laoban promised to pay out in this arrangement is larger than in a monthly system, it really allowed him to maintain construction momentum while waiting out the upper level financial struggles to be sorted out. But for the Chinese labor, the question of whether they could get paid eventually or not was constantly haunting their mind after they heard of all these gossip and rumors regarding the project's financial situation. So it's very uncommon for them to quit in just a few months. So it's very common for them to quit in just a few months due to the fear of not getting the ultimate paycheck. However, none of the Chinese workers who quit were able to secure some wage from the Laoban like the Lao labor because they depend on Laoban for everything. A few did go up to Laoban to ask for that before the last departure trip from the camp, and the Laoban would always reply, the money will arrive in your Chinese bank account in the next few days. But that never actually happened, and these Chinese workers knew that, but they could not drive a harder bargain because they have to rely on the Laoban for the right to leave the camp to capture bus or flight to go home. Of course, not all Chinese workers left the railway without putting up a serious fight for their unpaid wage, especially for those who had worked for an extended period of time on the project. That's why at the dawn of 2018 Chinese New Year, a group of such workers decided to protest for wage directly from upper level coordinator, the Laoban, who recruited them into Laos, were at the verge of bankruptcy himself at that time because of the railway. So these workers knew that their last chance to get paid lied in the SOE. As the railway's draconian top-down financial exploitations continued on, an increasing number of Laoban actually encouraged their workers to go up to confront coordinators directly. Some even joined force with the labor. In response, the SOE resolved to a more aggressive measures to quell the protests. The dynamic result in a dramatic scene occurred last month when the SOE hired Lao soldiers to station at their labor camp and threatened protesting crowd with gun. The Laoban at Sing told me, China Railway Ace Division owes us 7 million yuan. It refers to pay us and leave us nothing to eat, and then send in police to shoot us. With all the messiness and drama in mind, I came to a few concluding points. First, while we worry about the potential victim of China's unsustainable lending, we also need to be crystal clear that vulnerable Chinese actors, like private investors and laborers involved in the production of BRI, have already fallen victim to the financial practice. So in the end, is there a clear winner or loser out of BRI? One may think that the Chinese state stands as the ultimate winner in the Lao case as it gets the railway built. But let's not forget that Beijing hopes to use BRI as a spatial fix to solve the problem in China's domestic political economy, which threaten the regime's stability, like overcapacity, surplus labor, and social inequality. So what does it mean for the regime to end up with a troop of grieving Laoban and labor who felt that they are hustled by the state into BRI? And third, it is safe to conclude that Chinese state does not possess power to push any actors who lie outside of its authoritarian thunder into fulfilling its agenda. It clearly lacks effective mechanism to keep Lao state committed to the initial financial setup for the railway. And I believe that any future arrangement regarding debts between China and other southern states would be remade through similar negotiated processes. And indebted states would enjoy much more room than imagined to maneuver for their own interests. And that's all for my talk. I thought I'll talk for 2 hours, but it ends like in half an hour. It's great. And a lot of the materials I covered here are included in this paper that just gets published, in case you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. I think this is a great talk, and I'm glad we have a lot of time to discuss because I feel like the story that you're telling is something that we don't hear in the regular media at all. We always hear this macro story about Laos and China, but we never hear about what's actually happening on the ground. So I think there should be a lot of opportunities for further discussion, and I hope we have some good discussion and questions. Does anybody want to start off with questions? You can also put your question in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask if you want. Well, maybe I'll ask a question because there's some information that you included there, Kelly, that wasn't in your dissertation that I hadn't heard before, because you're obviously keeping up with what's going on over there now. I mean, why do you think these difficulties haven't really made it into the media? I mean, why are there very little reporting about the money not getting down to these companies and the Lao ban and all the problems with the Lao and the Chinese labor doesn't seem to have made it into the regular media at all?
I think, well, first of all, Lao is not very covered in media spotlight in general, right? And then for the Chinese side, these dynamics are like censored. So when I get this videos and photos from my informants, they actually really want to get their grievances out to the Chinese media because they don't speak other language. So the only thing they can reach out to is the Chinese journalists or like people like me. But then we get the information command from Chinese embassies in Vientiane saying that don't report anything that's unreliable. So it basically said, especially about the railway. So basically there is a strong effort to make sure that all the information about the railway comes only out through the official channel. So basically only the project company, the railway project company, and that would be like the state-owned enterprise representative answering all questions and giving information. That's why.
Have any media contacted you to ask you about these issues?
Not foreign media. And Chinese media are all censored, so.
Right. Other questions, comments? Please speak up.
Hi, Ian. I have a question for Dr. Chen.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Dr. Chen, thanks for that talk. That was excellent and good to see you presenting here. So the question is basically, so you've highlighted all these problems occurring in Laos in terms of Chinese investment for the BRI, etc. Are similar problems also occurring in other countries that China has been investing in? Are there parallels here, or is this something very unique to Laos in particular? Thank you.
Hi, Siddhar. I'm disappointed that you didn't turn on your camera. So I think what I observe in Laos is actually a prevailing situation of Chinese state-sponsored infrastructure project overseas. And because some of these Chinese contractors work on the Lao Railway had experience working in Latin America and Africa on Chinese project before. So they would tell me that it's really normal for the project to have like no payout at the beginning for a long period of time. And then suddenly the financial situation would be sorted out and then they will get paid. But what happened after BRI is that China in recent years really like basically did an unsustainable leap forward on expansion overseas. So they started aggressively financing projects, but the states want to aggressively push these agendas, but it doesn't have the sustainable financial resource to do it. So what happened is that now these kind of SOEs exploiting private capital become more severe and it lasts longer. Like it become like even these Laoban who are used to be exploited in this way feel like this time it's like so unbearable. So that there's a tendency, worsening tendency regarding like the financial situation on Chinese overseas project.
So we have a question in the chat, which I'll read out from Chanida or Jip. But before that, I just want to say I love the phrase unsustainable great leap forward. That sounds like a great title for a future article. But anyway, here's the question. So thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I would like to know more how these unpaid laborers manage to live during the ongoing construction? Did they create some sort of social support or alliances among each other? Or did they seek help from outside organizations like other NGOs and others? I think that must be for the Chinese laborers in particular.
Thanks for your question, Jip. So I'll answer the third part of your question first. Did they seek out for help from outside organizations? So first of all, these are people who are literally dragged out of China and they've never been abroad and then parachuted into a very isolated construction site that oftentimes doesn't even have cellular network. So they would not have access to internet and they don't speak any English or Lao. And they're very afraid to go outside. So how are they gonna seek like any outside help? They're not. And also they're actually heavily criminalized on media. And I don't think NGOs and all other sort of active civil society in Laos would be intuitively interested to like reach out to them, viewing them as someone who needs help in the first place, right? Because they are always like framed as these people who like disrupted local society and, you know, harass local women and really just a neo-colonial presence of China on the ground. And how does these unpaid labor manage to leave, like reproduce during the ongoing construction? So they stay on the construction site. And the Laoban covers their food and shelter. So on that part, they're not gonna be starved. So that's another reason why like this labor regime of like getting paid like over like 3 months or 6 months or a year is possible in this scenario, because sometimes when male labor go out to pick up work overseas, they are sourced at some rural village in China. And their family would want the paycheck to direct it towards the woman in the family, not the man, okay? So it's a kind of arrangement. You go work, but then your wife at home get the paycheck. So to discipline the man abroad. And that's why this model is sustainable and common. And did they create some sort of social support or alliance among each other? Well, on the same labor camp, of course. There's support and alliance, but there's also a lot of internal conflict, because the labors are sourced from very different, like diverse regions and channels. Yeah, so like even in the labor camp that I did my research, and you got labor who like basically some come by himself, some come as like a group of 5 to 6 with like a mini leader who recruited all others. So what happened is that people feel like they're in a pecking order to get paid, because they join at a different time. So there's always this suspicion and caution of who's closer with Laoban and who is gonna get paid first. Also because they're not getting paid. So it ends up like those mini recruiters who themselves are laborers gets blamed a lot by other people who he recruited. Basically, it's like the people from the same village in China were like, why the hell you bring us to this railway that doesn't pay them? Something like that. So there's alliance and support, but there's also like a lot of like internal conflict and tension.
Okay, so we have two requests for questions. The first will be Al McCoy and the second will be Ik. So Al, could you please ask your question?
Sure, thank you, Ian. What I want to do is shift from the micro, which was wonderful, to the macro perspective. First of all, if you think about the continuity of empires past, the Iberians, the British and the Dutch using slave labor, then the British using the mobilization of millions of indentured laborers worldwide, Indians to the South Pacific and the Caribbean, overseas Chinese across Southeast Asia, and then internal migration. And now China is mobilizing the kind of latter-day imperial equivalent, free unpaid labor, okay? So there's a kind of imperial genius in the process. And what it looks like, if from a geopolitical perspective, is that China is nominally mobilizing about $1 trillion to get about an 8 to 10-fold multiplier effect. For example, can you see this, Ian? Okay, is that shown? Can you just show that?
I can't see anything.
Okay, can you see it?
Did you
Oh,
turn on your
try this.
video?
Let me try my camera this way. Okay, let me try that
Oh.
this way. All right, can you see that?
Now we can see you, yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
fine. Okay, that's last
Oh,
July.
lift it up a little bit.
Okay, that's the front page of the Bangkok Post announcing that the $6.5 billion Kunming to Vientiane Railway will be complemented by a $65 billion Trans-Southeast Asia rail network, using that connection from Vientiane to Bangkok as the hub for a wider network. And so what it looks to me like from a geopolitical perspective is China is, as a certain imperial genius, is mobilizing ancillary funds by the societies that it's connecting, and similarly by minimizing its payments to the workers on the project, mobilizing lots of underpaid or almost free labor, and building this vast enterprise, this transport infrastructure that is linking all of Eurasia. And so I think from a macro perspective, all the agony and the suffering of the workers you described is very much along the line of this 5 centuries of continuity. All those that get caught up in these grand imperial designs at the base suffer, but the design itself has an overarching logic that may or may not work. So I guess there's a question. Is the system working? Is the rail getting built? Will the trains run on time?
So,
it's for you, Dr. Chen. Sorry to pluck you out of the micro, which was wonderful. But I mean, there is a genius there. I mean, it would be nice if they paid everybody, but hey, then they'd run out of money for other projects, you know?
yeah.
So it's from a Chinese perspective, it's much more rational not to pay.
Okay, so thanks, Professor McCoy. You know, I took a class with you like years ago.
You wrote a paper, a great paper.
Yeah, I wrote a paper about the railway.
Yeah,
and
about the Kunming to
people would
Hanoi Railroad.
remember the railway is about French Empire building that expensive railway from Vietnam to China, and it bankrupted France, right? And that's what empire ended up with. By building this expensive, unsustainable project using free labor, it bankrupted itself. So like from my perspective, I'm seeing China following the same kind of pattern. It is at this moment getting a railway built with unpaid Chinese labor. But my question to you is that as a historian, do you see this as a sustainable mode of empire building? Like wouldn't China follow the French case of bankrupting itself? Because I totally see that happening. And especially with all these angry Laobans and labor on the ground, is the Chinese regime itself is being increasingly challenged by its people. So how would this be a sustainable mode of empire building?
Well, first of all, you have to separate, I think, out the balance sheet from several considerations, okay? First of all, that railroad, as you know, the Kunming to Hanoi Railroad, was at the time one of the great engineering marvels of the age. In many ways equivalent to the Panama Canal. I mean, the incredible span bridges they built across those ravines in southeastern China, the tunnels that they dug, given that age and given the weakness of the steam-powered pneumatic hammers, was extraordinary. It's an unheralded, unappreciated engineering marvel. Also, it did have a geopolitical import. It did effectively link Hanoi and French Indochina into southwestern China. And so for a time, you know, it didn't realize its economic potential, but in terms of its accomplishment, in terms of its geopolitical import, it did reinforce the empire to a certain extent, okay? Now, that raises questions. First of all, literally when I said, oh, the train's going to run on time, is this railroad going to work, okay? Because the other big Chinese project, which is the Gwadar one, which is going 16,000 feet elevation, that's on the drawing boards. That hasn't happened yet. The one from southwestern China, the Pakistan-China $46 billion rail pipeline corridor. The road has been built, of course, but the rail may never be built because of the difficulties of building a railroad at about 16,000 feet elevation with massive snowfall. So the question for you is this railroad actually going to work? Will the trains run frequently? Will they carry passengers and freight? Will they link to Bangkok and Singapore and give China this window this access to Southeast Asia? And will there be multiplier effects? Those are, I think, the imperial questions.
Mhm.
Okay, that's a question for you. So what do you think?
So like by whether the railway would work, you mean the Kunming-Singapore railway, right? Not just the Laos section.
Right,
So,
well, the whole thing, basically, the critical
Yeah.
sector, I think, is Kunming, Bangkok. Right,
yeah.
right? Okay, because the plan that is outlined in this Bangkok Post article is to have feeder lines and overcome the overcrowded roads that link Bangkok to its industrial processing zone and solve multiple transport problems. So it's going to have multiplier effects.
Yeah. So I agree with you on all this, and I think that we'll need to see whether the section from Vientiane to Bangkok would be built or not. And right now, it's only like the TRANS-LAOS railway seems very solidly moving forward on the ground, and I think it's gonna run on time next year based on the information I have. And actually, even if the train doesn't go to Bangkok, it will have lots of multiplying effects because when it's already happening, I mean, like there are lots of like land grabs along the railway already, and then these very like well-informed Lao elites has been like strategically placing their future business along the railway, jostling for the opportunity that it's gonna be produced by it. So I think an infrastructure has lots of these derivative economic opportunities. But the problem is the Chinese state that put its heavy weight into pushing these projects to happen, it can monopolize these opportunities, right? So there are gonna be a lot more other parties benefiting from this process, like from the materiality of this infrastructure. So that's my point, is that China definitely want to have that kind of empire building mindset when it starts out planning BRI, but things does not follow what it wants.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just one study for you to consider. I don't know if you're familiar, last year, the World Bank, in its various project studies, did one on the economic impact of the BRI. And their conclusion was that among the 55 participating countries in the transport sector of BRI, which is the bulk of it, that there was a 3.4% increase in GDP and a 2.4% increase in social welfare. So from a macroeconomic perspective, the BRI is achieving President Xi's stated aim of not only expanding China's reach, but also lifting the world's miserable millions out of poverty. According to the World Bank, at a macro level across 55 nations, it's working. If you want, you can send me an email with the reference to your article, which I want to read, and I'll send you the link to this World Bank study, which I think you could read and contest, because that's very macro, 55 nations, compared to your very micro. And it'd be interesting for you to think about, what these guys have missed, which I'm sure is a lot. Okay, so thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay,
so send me an email.
Okay, Ik, I think you're next.
So thank you so much for your presentation. And I would like to bring you down to the field a little bit by asking you about your data collection experience. I'm wondering about that because part of your information looks provocative and, having a little bit sensitive in certain sense. So is there any challenges that you face during your field data collection? Because I have so many friends as a researchers, went to collect the data in Laos, and especially with the Chinese. Even in the case of Cambodia, data collection with the new Chinese immigrants will be an issue. And the second one is, I'm wondering about the relationship as you observed. Is there any contact or specific kind of relationship between this Chinese worker and the new Chinese immigrant that came into Laos? Yeah, that's two questions.
So the first question is about fieldwork access, right? And the second question is about whether Chinese these Chinese labor have came in contact with Chinese new immigrants. Could you clarify a little bit about the second question? Because what do you mean by new immigrants? That I thought.
The new immigrants that I refer to, it means the new flow of Chinese immigrants after SEA Games that held in Laos, and that the Lao government received the loan from Chinese government in exchange of, you know, moving in hundred thousands of Chinese families into the city, and they found a new Chinese city 1 hour away from Vientiane.
Okay. Thanks for the question. So I can answer your second question quickly because it's easy. So that project, Taiwan Lake, right? You are referring to is also part of my research, and I just want to clarify that the moving Chinese family into that area is a rumor. It was never intended that way, and it never happened. So there is no such Chinese immigrants as you imagine. So as you can see, there are lots of rumors flowing around about China, and some of them have really like a lot of public purchase that even you believe in that, right? And it's not true. So for the first question, the fieldwork access, yeah, it is challenging to research Chinese who are working on these controversial project in particular. So I started out wanting to work on this project, but when I get to Laos, I don't have access. So I end up working on other projects, like the Taiwan Lake project, which grants easier access. And then I spent like 6-7 months not working on the railway at all. But then suddenly, like these people who were like, oh, I'm connected to the railway in this or that ways, and start to tell me information about the railway. And I slowly piece together information in that sense. That's how I get access. You just need to be patient, and then let them trust you first, and don't just go up and ask questions and look like a really naive researcher that holds some grudge against Chinese investment. That would never work. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let me just jump in here and ask another question that kind of is a follow-up in some ways to Al's question, but it takes a different angle. So what about the Lao government? I mean, in some ways, you know, they have not come up with the money to pay for their part of the railroad, and yet the railroad is still being built. I mean, does this show Laos to be a very savvy negotiator when they've got this train being built and they haven't even paid the part that they were going to pay, and yet the train is coming to Vientiane on time? I mean, is that not brilliance on the part of the Lao government? I'm talking about agency. We all assume that the Lao government has no agency, and I think this is often a mistake. And I think that you know, I'm just wondering that, you know, I would like you to speak about Lao agency to some degree.
Okay, thanks. But first of all, there isn't a coherent Lao government. Okay, there's multiple factions of Lao government that holds different attitude towards this project. And that's primarily the reason why the Lao cannot assemble this budget for the railway. So what happened is that the specific faction supporting the railway is a couple top government official and the officials from Ministry of Public Work and Transport. It's a ministry that handles all the infrastructure work. So all the railway related business was handled by that ministry, and they don't want to like share the information with other ministries that are supposed to be involved in the railway, like Ministry of Energy and Mines, because the railway has 70% like underground tunnels. So the railway building process is actually a geology survey, right? By building a railway, the process would reveal a lot of geological structure of Laos and reveal where it has mines and where it hasn't. And they're supposed to share that information with MEM, Ministry of Energy and Mines, and they didn't do that. They also don't want to share information with the bureau that handle land issues. So basically the railway, the exact route of the railway, the station of the railway, and all these informations are like kept strictly in Ministry of Public Work and Transportation, they would bring the map of the railway to other ministries, show the map to the officials there, but then not leaving even a copy of the map or material to the other ministries. So what happened is that the other ministries feel like they're left out of cashing in the railway, because everybody knows this is a great opportunity to shake up the entire landscape of Laos and create so much like profitable opportunities. So all these other ministries are become sort of passive aggressive about the railway projects, and they don't collaborate. But in order to assemble together state budget, you need a collaboration. So that's the political climate about the railway. And that's how Laos become, in Ian's sense, savvy of like hustle a railway in without paying money. But what happened is that it's actually like exchanging land instead of money as an equity into the railway. So now that financial deal is being restructured, Laos is not gonna put in like money, but it's putting in more land along the railway than originally planned. So what happens that you see news of like these nonsense new city project coming out of the TRANS-LAOS railway, that is the land that's being assembled as equity. And before land-based equity to become profitable, you need like further investment. So what happened is that Chinese companies are channeling further investment into this land, trying to make it profitable and sort of pay off for the railway.
But I think it might be difficult for them to make it profitable. So this may be initially Laos giving up their land, but we've seen this with many other rubber concessions in Laos, which were done by Chinese companies, and the Chinese thought they would make a lot of money off this land, and in the end, they ended up abandoning it. So I think we have to see whether, the Laos is giving them land, but will they actually be able to use that profitably? I mean, that's another question, which I think we still have to wait and see about.
Mm-hmm. So I think that the opaque and fragmented Laos sovereignty work as a buffer for it to benefit from all these like investments that's coming in.
Yeah.
Do you agree with me?
Questions? Anybody else have any other questions or comments?
Ian, Dr. Chen had a question to you about, it was very direct to you, her last comment.
What was that question?
What was the fragmentation of the, she should say it again, but it's something about the fragmentation of the land disposition in Laos serves as something of a buffer. Okay, she might ask her to elaborate because you could comment. Go.
Oh, yeah, I was just saying that I think the the opaque and fragmented Laos sovereignty act as a buffer to help it benefit from like foreign investments, because it kept like derailing these foreign capitals initiatives when they come into Laos.
I think that's more of a comment than a question, and I wouldn't disagree with you on that. So thank you. Okay, other questions or comments?
Ian, could I make a suggestion or a request?
Mm-hmm.
It would be interesting for Dr. Chen to look at that World Bank study that I just posted. It's a 2019 study. You know, making.
Yeah, I saw it. I saw your comment in the post, in the chat. Thanks.
Yeah, it'd be interesting for Dr. Chen to just, have a chance to read the study and maybe send us an email to the center that we could disseminate on her micro perspective on this celebratory macro study, laying claim to that 3.4% increase in GDP, which that's phenomenal, to get if there's basis to that, that's very interesting, because that disarms a lot of the criticism of the BRI as essentially white elephant projects, wasteful, mismanaged, etc. So it's an interesting study.
I wonder about that. I mean, in the case of Laos, Laos has been growing at a 6% rate for many, many years now on an annual basis. So 3 to 5% sounds high if you think about most developed countries, but it's not that high if you look at what's been happening historically in Laos. So I'm not sure how they can attribute that all to the railroad. But I haven't read the study, so maybe Dr. Chen will be able to enlighten us more.
I think, Ian, what they're
Can you
arguing
all
is
just call me Kelly? It makes me really uncomfortable that you call me Dr. Chen.
Okay. Okay.
Ian, I think the implications is that it's boosting GDP by 3.4%. Okay, so in other words, if Laos, is achieving a 6%, then a certain percentage of that is attributable to this transport project. Okay, so it's 3.4% across the board.
Thank you. Other questions?
I think Catherine may have a question coming up.
Yeah, I saw Catherine jumping around there.
I put it in the chat. But basically, how do you see this mess playing out? What are going to be the long-term implications in Laos and China, Chinese reputation, etc.?
I don't know how to answer your question, but then, like, I felt like this mess is gonna, like, set China on a track like the Vietnam Railway sets track for the French Empire. I feel like because it's so unsustainable, and also because China right now is handled by an authoritarian regime, and as always, at the end of an authoritarian regime, when there's power transition, there's like these, scrambles and a lot of disruption. So I feel like when this whole thing come to an end, with the end of this administration, which I don't know how long it'll last, and then with all the eruption of these tensions of like this lot of unsustainable things Chinese government has been doing in recent years, all like, come together to a moment that maybe like make the PRC regime unsustainable eventually. That's my thought. What's your thought about this, Catherine?
I don't know. I'm trying to figure out who's going to be left holding the money. How are these debts going to get paid off?
Oh, who is gonna get the money? That's the SOEs. So like when the debt is, so basically Laos and China are still working on figuring out the borrowing deal. But I think eventually the bank will inject the money into the project and the project will go into the SOEs, but they will have like make up these multiple excuses of not paying to the ground level private investors and labor. So there's an incentive of all the SOEs involved to like maximize their profit on this unprofitable project. And that makes financial exploitation even more like severe. And I think that's already happening.
And the workers that are stuck in the mountains, how will they get out?
So like what happens is that when they go protest at the camp, at the beginning, they just gave the worker enough money to go back home, like take a bus or like just stuck them into the next flight to go back to China. And once they're back in China, of course, their voice doesn't get heard. But then like, I don't know what like happened like now, because I've not been there for 2 years. At the time when I'm there, that's what I see. And I feel like it's probably the same. They'll just find out many ways to not let these nasty things out.
Okay, we have a question in the chat from Larry Ashman that I'll read out. In comparison to other BRI countries, are the Chinese companies more or less interested in Laos?
I feel like Laos is like deemed by Chinese investors as a sort of untapped gold, because other Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, like basically in Singapore, something like that, they think that the room for Chinese capital to get in is smaller because there's already a lot of other Chinese capital there, right? So Chinese, when they are choosing an investment destination, they fear the competition from their like same countrymen. So the thing is that they think Laos has less Chinese presence in the past, so it's a frontier that has rooms for them to make big money. And also another thing that attracts Chinese investors is that Laos is like cheaper and closer to go to. So I see a lot of these like really daring investors who really have no idea what Laos is and just go there thinking that they'll automatically end up with big money, but then no.
Yeah, that sounds like the story of many investors, not only Chinese. But Al has a question that's apparently involving Mike Cullinane, and he says, Mike, wake up. So Al, can you take it away?
To follow up on Catherine's question and Kelly's response about, how will the dust settle? Oftentimes for questions like that, the past is useful. And to pick a somewhat larger project, the Panama Canal, which Mike Cullinane knows well from family history and also from considerable reading. At the time, the Panama Canal was also an incredibly controversial project, lots of accidents. There were 40,000 contract laborers recruited from across the Caribbean. I don't know how their payrolls went. They were given substandard housing, poor conditions. Mike's family was a part of the American engineering elite that lived very nicely in the canal zone, comparable to the managers in the offices that Kelly was describing. And then when the canal was opened, the vicissitudes, whatever they might have been, the suffering, the accidents, and there were lots of accidents on the canal. And the poor workers that suffered those accidents, I don't think were given disability payments. They returned to Caribbean islands crippled, for the rest of their lives, and their history is wiped away by the miracle of the project when it opens. And I'm wondering if that might not be a kind of precursor and a precedent for what could happen with this Lao Railway, that all of this will be washed away when the flags of Laos and China are waving in the breeze and the first chain comes sweeping through majestically. Mike, what do you think? And Dr. Chen, what do you think?
I think that's definitely the case, but I'm here to document what's happened. So yeah.
Except for your article in economic geography.
Yeah.
As on the Panama case, of course, is that I spent most of my time with what were called the gold employees, the people who were paid on a gold dollar standard. But there wasn't, to my knowledge, on Panama at least, there was no non-paid labor. I mean, the American system paid the Haitians and Jamaicans at a lower rate, and they did not, of course, provide them with the facilities that they supplied for the white Americans who were the gold employees. But it didn't come out the same way. And the other thing is interesting is, and I don't know if it would work out in this case, but many of the Haitians and Jamaicans that were recruited for the labor on the Panama Canal are now Panamanians. In other words, they stayed in Panama. They didn't return to Haiti or to Jamaica. And they are now citizens of the nation of Panama, many of whom are still cutting grass along the edge of the canal.
But Mike, did they all receive their salaries on time?
Yes. This was a very efficient system. It was an exploitative system where there were people who were paid at a higher rate because of their race and because of their skills to some extent, but the unskilled labor died, as Al suggested. They were blown up by dynamite accidents. They suffered from, they were not treated in the same way in terms of health benefits, like they suffered from yellow fever and malaria, right? But they did get their silver, they were called silver workers. And they were paid on a basis of the Panama's currency, not US currency, but they got their salaries. And they had some subsidies for housing. It was just substandard housing compared to the white workers.
Hey, so I have like a question with all these discussions about China's current empire building and the empire buildings in the history. So like, I feel like in whatever case that we talk about in the past, in the case of empire building, it's the empire exploiting other laborers. But in China's case, it's China exploiting its own labor, its own people. Like it's not trying, or it has not been successfully, like exploiting labor of other country. That's primarily the reason why it's bringing Chinese labor, right? So like there's this
But
like
they did try to exploit the Lao labor. They just weren't successful at it.
Exactly, but then you see this past efforts of like even like building Panama Canal, the like Americans succeeded in exploiting local labor, right? But Chinese can't do that to an extent that the entire railway is built by Chinese labor. There's not like only the maid on the labor camp is hired from local community from Lao. That's the extent to which like China is not like acting like a previous empire. And I just don't, I wonder what you all think about it, since you all like keep drawing parallels between past cases and present.
Yeah, if I can respond to that. If China's, according to the fragmentary information we have, wherever they operate beyond China, they seem to have considerable difficulties in their management of local personnel. In Africa, there have been violent demonstrations, anti-Chinese demonstrations in East Africa. You're describing another situation. All empires that do mass mobilization of labor, particularly for construction, which, by the way, is inherently dangerous because it doesn't have the repetition of a factory. Every time you lay a dynamite charge, every time you cut into a hillside, you don't know what the geology is like. You can get a collapse, okay? Workers get injured all the time. And so you're mobilizing labor for very dangerous tasks where they can suffer lifelong injuries. The capacity to do that for an empire, particularly one that's expanding infrastructure as China is critical. And unless China somehow develops a capacity to handle its labor and get beyond the kinds of things you're describing and what I've read about in the demonstrations against Chinese companies in Africa as well, this over the long term is going to weaken China's capacity to not only build but to maintain its facilities. That's why you may have read that Beijing is negotiating apparently with Eric Prince, of the Blackwater paramilitary security firm to provide, and the funder of right-wing militias in the United States in this current election. The brother of our education secretary, Betsy DeVos, Beijing is working with him apparently to negotiate private contract security for their infrastructure projects worldwide because they're running into security issues. And it's most ironic that Beijing is dealing with Eric Prince. So this can be a problem not only for the construction, but also for the maintenance of facilities. The inability to work effectively with local counterparts and to work reasonably with local labor, that's a weakness.
So in that sense, has China achieved that empire status? Like it doesn't have that power to like mobilize labor, as you said, especially foreign labor. And it doesn't have like, it looks like it's making a huge concession when it's trying to get its agenda achieved overseas, right?
How can I put it? Every empire is by its nature a collaborative enterprise. Let me just quote the maxim from the famous British historian of Africa, Ronald Robinson. He said the British Empire expanded for 200 years to cover a quarter of the globe because of the effective collaboration with collaborating subordinate elites. And that same empire collapsed in 20 years when those local elites shifted from collaboration to non-cooperation. Then it was over for the British Empire. So in essence, every expanding empire, although it looks from the the imperial center to be this autonomous, powerful apparatus. In fact, rests upon these kinds of exchanges you've been documenting so eloquently, so effectively. Those have to work in some way, okay, for that empire to succeed and be sustainable. So, you know, so you have some interesting questions that will carry you forward in your research, looking at this over long term, because this is not over. This is going to run for another decade anyway. It's an interesting and important project.
Any last questions? We should be finishing up soon, so maybe one more question, and that'll probably bring us to an end if we have one.
Or we can just chat about elections. It's like important.
Only after we start recording.
Oh, I didn't realize we were recording. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
But let me ask what I have one last question, and that is this. Do you think that you know, how much is the delay on the section in Thailand? Because already there's a big delay on that section, right? So how much is that going to affect the economic viability? Because if that railroad just goes to Vientiane, I mean, a lot of the economic activity that was sort of expected from it is not going to be realized until it gets to Bangkok or until it gets to Singapore. So, you know, how is that going to affect the economic benefits that might come out of this project? Because it's very much dependent on the Thai side of it. And as we've heard recently, you know, it's still a bit unclear exactly how things are going to play out in Thailand.
I think it's clear to everybody, like in Laos, who are like working on the railway, that this Laos section of railway is not profitable at all, not in any sense. So, like, yeah, if the railway is not going to Thailand, though, then like this railway itself would never pay off itself. But then, like, it still creates a lot of like opportunity for people to benefit, like profit from that. So, I mean, I know you're talking about this like macroeconomic benefit of the railway, right? I don't know how to answer your tricky question. Like, it's like, we all know it's not gonna, like, if it just goes to Vientiane, then it doesn't mean that much for all like the trade and, you know, tourists or anything. So
Well,
yeah, I'm ready to like chit chat. So
okay. Well, I think we're all about ready to finish up now. So let's all give a virtual applause to Kelly for her very interesting and provocative presentation and a sort of a ground level view of from the Chinese side what's going on with relation to the railroad. Let's wish her well in her new position, and hope that everything goes well in Hong Kong.